Hello, comrades. Welcome to our latest session in this new series on revolution and counter-revolution between 1914 and 1938. We're very pleased to welcome Roger Silverman for 2 sessions. He'll be looking at the Russian Revolution in some detail, which of course encapsulates both a revolution and a counter-revolution. And I think Roger's looking at both in a chronological way up to the revolution and then what happened afterwards. This is obviously hugely important to our forces on the working class. It was the first time probably that during capitalism, a whole country was taken over by a revolution from below, and it inspired millions. And then also, of course, what happened in the Soviet Union afterwards also served to help with the defeat of our forces. Stalinism was, used against our forces. And look what's happening in the Soviet Union. Is that what you want, etc. So there's a huge number of issues to discuss with this question, and we're very pleased to have Roger with us now to start with that discussion.
I should just say I've explained to Tina that my connection sometimes lets me down. If so, there might be a couple of minutes gap while I rush to a fallback option that I've set up downstairs, okay? Right, comrades, the Russian Revolution. It's over a century since the Russian Revolution, but its legacy continues to cast a huge shadow over subsequent history. Its impact still today reverberates throughout the world. It remains a constant spectre at the feast of the rich. Since its lessons lie buried in a century of sludge by all those determined to malign its meaning from all conceivable angles, it's the duty of socialists to unearth them and to bring them back to light. Some people dismiss it as a wicked conspiratorial putsch. Some ascribe to it all the subsequent horrors of the 20th century. A few still present gaudy chocolate box oil painting extravaganzas in its honor. What matters to us is that this was one of those rare moments when ordinary people took control of their own lives. People humbled over countless generations to eking out a miserable, anonymous existence of hardship, toil, and submission, suddenly rose up and stormed the stage, determined for once to grasp hold of their destiny and shape history to their needs. History leaves its indelible traces in human culture. Russia's most notorious contributions to the world's vocabulary had at that time been words like krut, that's knout, the instrument of torture by which prisoners were whipped, often to death, and pogrom, the frenzied mob massacre of a terrorized minority community. Since then, of course, it's added traces of both the peaks and troughs of its world-shaking subsequent history. For instance, the word Soviet, on the one hand, and Gulag on the other. Russia entered the 20th century as a vast empire spanning 1/6 of the Earth's surface, a land of savage despotism ruled by the Tsars, and by 1917 had been further crippled by years of slaughter on the Eastern Front of the First World War, in which some 3 million Russians had perished. Organized into democratic councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants' deputies, elected at every unit of labor with direct right of recall, working people briefly held the power in their own hands. Tsars and landowners, racists and aristocrats, generals and executioners, capitalists and renegades were all swept into oblivion. Production was for the first time in history to be rationally planned rather than subordinated to private profiteering and the blind forces of the market. And yet the October Revolution, so named in accordance with the then current calendar, which of course actually took place in November, remains a gigantic paradox. It was treated worldwide as the first step towards a new era in history, a socialist civilization. And yet the regime which was soon to emerge from it became one of history's most bloodthirsty tyrannies. Its ideals were soon to be perverted into a hideous mockery of socialism. Millions of workers were to perish in the torture chambers and slave camps of Stalin's police state. And in 1991, the crumbling relic of the entity still mockingly called the Soviet Union finally collapsed in ruins. So why is it necessary to penetrate the mountain of misinformation to understand the real meaning of the revolution? Because apologists for capitalism are fond of crowing that Russia's current economic devastation is an indictment of decades of socialism. The truth is, of course, is exactly the opposite. On the contrary, it was the downfall of the prevailing system of state ownership, by then, of course, rusting and creaking under the dead weight of bureaucratic mismanagement, that saw Russia transformed into a wasteland ravaged by adventurers and cowboy gangsters, largely former bureaucrats. It was with the restoration of a raw and primitive capitalism that Russia was brought to the brink of catastrophe, devastated by what was probably the sharpest drop in production and living standards that any country has ever endured. Real gross domestic product fell by more than 40%, bringing hyperinflation, lawlessness, destitution, and despair. If Russia's economy later gained a very marginal and temporary respite, it was only due to a short-lived boost in world oil prices. What a contrast with the formative years of the planned economy. Even in the thieving hands of a greedy and wasteful parasitic elite, the very survival over 3/4 of a century of the nationalized economy, not to mention its later extensions to swathes of Eastern Europe, Asia, and beyond, fatally belies the capitalists' triumphalist sneers. So, it was at its weakest link that the chain of capitalism had first snapped. Russia in 1917 was a semi-colony. For every 100 square kilometers of land, there are only 0.4 kilometers of railway track. 80% of the population scratched a bare existence out of their tiny strips of land, using the most primitive tools and methods. Agriculture was fragmented into nearly 24 million smallholdings. Over 70% of Russian subjects were totally illiterate, and what reactionary priest-ridden education there was focused only on rearing a new generation of bureaucrats within the elite. Heavy industry was dependent on foreign finance capital. French, British, Belgian, and other Western investors owned shares amounting to 90% of Russia's mines, 50% of her chemical industry, over 40% of her engineering plant, and 42% of her banking stock. Russia had experienced no bourgeois revolution clearing away feudal restrictions, as in the West. With its vast underpopulated territory, overrun throughout the centuries by nomadic hordes, Russia had a very sluggish economic development. Capitalism had been too weak to achieve political power through the peasant revolt of the 18th century or the abortive coup d'etat of 1825, and had arrived on the scene too late to hope to compete with the modern Western monopolies on the world market or pursue an independent historic role. It was bound hand and foot to the Tsarist autocracy at home and to the big financiers abroad. A belated spurt of development only came following the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, whereby the absolutist monarchy began to balance more heavily on liberal landowners, nascent capitalists, and foreign bankers, releasing reserves of manpower for industry. Thus, capitalism in Russia did not evolve in such a way as to rest securely on a wide stratum of intermediate small business entrepreneurs, stable capitalist farmers, etc. Lacking any solid social foundation, it hung precariously suspended over society by world imperialism on the strings of the Holy Tsar. Thriving on substantial foreign investment, industrial enterprises now sprung up using the most sophisticated machinery and production techniques. Russia's belated growth prepared the rapid development of a concentrated industrial working class, and with it a new culture of defiance, solidarity, and militancy. In 1914, while 17.8% of American industrial workers were employed in factories with over 1,000 workers, the corresponding figure in Russia was as high as 41.4%, and higher still in Moscow and Petrograd. Young peasants streaming off the land found themselves suddenly plunged into great mechanical sweatshops of the most intensive exploitation, and they came fresh to the realities of industrial class struggle and militant organization more rapidly than their counterparts in the West, with their gradual evolution through intermediate stages of handicraft and manufacture. We see a similar process in China today, which I believe represents the great hope for the future of the world working class. I hope maybe to come back to that later. Now, the early Russian socialists had been so-called populists who believed that the Russian peasantry could jump straight into a peculiarly Russian rural form of communism. Paralyzed by the inertia of the masses, they sought shortcuts to utopia through evangelism and terrorism alternately. First, they descended on the villages preaching revolution, only to find themselves indignantly turned over by bemused peasants over to the police. Then, after 12 years' efforts, they managed to assassinate a Tsar. But the ruling caste having had no difficulty finding a new one, the outcome was simply a wave of executions and renewed repression. The execution, of course, including Lenin's elder brother. It was the stirrings of the Petrograd workers in the stormy strikes of the 1890s that first established Marxism in Russia. Soon came the revolution of 1905, the biggest upheaval in Europe since the Paris Commune of 1871. Independently of any theorist or agitator, the workers spontaneously formed the first Soviets, democratically elected workers' councils. In face of the workers' radicalization, the capitalist politicians hastily abandoned their tentative liberal demands for a measure of control over the monarchy. It was becoming clear that any effective challenge to the tottering regime could only come from the working class. At this point, it's worth reminding ourselves that at times of revolution, the first duty of a revolutionary is not to teach, but to learn. Just as it was the workers of the Paris Commune that taught Marx, and not vice versa, the necessity to smash the old state machine and the forms that workers' power would naturally take, so too it was the Petersburg workers who formed the Soviets, refuting the local Bolsheviks' conservative assistance that they would undermine the so-called leading role of the party, a salutary lesson which we must never forget. So prior to the outbreak of the revolution, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which was the Socialist International's Russian affiliate, if you like, the counterpart of the German SPD, had found itself profoundly split over the nature and goals of the coming revolution. Confining its outlook within the boundaries of Russia, the moderate Menshevik wing of the RSDLP could envisage no bolder aspiration than the installation of a liberal democratic government, which would then mechanically retread the path of Western capitalism. According to their sterile formula, until the entire historic mission of capitalism had been fulfilled and the economy had attained Western levels, the role of the Workers' Party would be to serve indefinitely as a loyal opposition. The Bolshevik wing considered this theory narrow and pedantic. They placed no reliance on a weak capitalist class inextricably entangled with foreign imperialism and hopelessly compromised by its collaboration with the despotic Tsarist state machine. Placing the role of the Russian Revolution firmly within internationalist horizons, they predicted that the victory of a democratic agrarian revolution in Russia, led by the workers and peasants, would act as an explosive catalyst, precipitating socialist revolution throughout Europe. Now, along with the Bolsheviks, Leon Trotsky, who was at that time independent of both wings, also envisaged the coming revolution in Russia as the first breakthrough of the workers of the world into the future, while also arguing that the Russian workers, supported by millions of poor peasants and allied to the workers of the metropolitan countries, could be the first to overthrow capitalism in alliance with the workers of Europe, leading the revolution inexorably onward to socialist measures. So while a capitalist Russia could only remain a semi-colony of Western imperialism, socialism could only be built hand in hand with the workers of the advanced countries. The events of 1917 quickly settled the argument. In February, against a background of famine and starvation, riots on the bread lines, a bloodbath on the battlefields, scandal in the palace, mutinies by soldiers, and even by the elite Cossack forces, it took just 8 brisk days of street protests, led above all by the defiant women of Petrograd, to bring the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty crashing to its downfall. We can add just a couple of interesting historical footnotes. First, that only 1 month prior to the collapse of the regime, Lenin had made a speech predicting the Russian and the Europe-wide revolution, but speculating that, as he put it, we of the older generation may not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution. That's a crushing riposte to those who ascribe the events of 1917 to a fiendish plot by wicked Bolshevik conspirators. Another interesting footnote that once the revolution had collapsed, with Lenin and Trotsky still stranded in exile and other giants languishing in Siberia, the second-level local mediocrities, Molotov and the murky provincial Stalin, were celebrating the assumption of power by a hastily assembled clique of aristocrats and bankers in a so-called provisional government, and even proposing fusion with the Mensheviks. Once the Tsarist regime had fallen, the so-called provisional government, which had stepped uninvited into the vacuum, had no following in the Soviets of workers, soldiers and peasants, which had sprung up overnight as a true parliament of the masses. Caught unawares and overcome with confusion, the local Bolshevik leaders on the spot prepared to join forces, as I say, with the Mensheviks. We can only highlight some key flashpoints of the cataclysmic social earthquake covering a huge landmass spread over 2 continents. In February, housewives queuing for dwindling supplies of bread began protesting. Soldiers opened fire. Dozens were mown down. The crowds swelled. The feared Cossacks were deployed. Driven by hunger and outrage, the masses stood firm, and at a rare, decisive moment, the troops' nerve wavered and the centuries-old Tsarist monarchy tottered. Tsar Nicholas's minister telegraphed to the Tsar, "The situation is serious. There is anarchy in the capital. The government is paralyzed." What was the Tsar's response? "That fat Rodzianko has written me some nonsense to which I will not even reply." Crowds of workers and soldiers ransacked government buildings, broke into police arsenals to arm themselves, burned them down, stormed the prisons. A council of workers and soldiers' deputies was formed. The revolution had begun. In April, Lenin returned to Russia. When he finally arrived after a dramatic ride through war-torn Europe at the Finland station in Leningrad, in Petrograd, to be welcomed by cheering crowds of workers, but also by a nervous delegation of local dignitaries with bouquets of flowers and pompous flowery speeches pleading for unity, Lenin steadfastly avoided their pleading gaze and spoke over their heads to the crowds, promptly dumping the bouquets and appealing over the heads of the reception committee to the working class for the overthrow of the clique that had usurped the power, welcoming the advance guard of the World Proletarian Army, denouncing any part in the shameful imperialist slaughter, and declaiming, "Long live the worldwide socialist revolution." But it was not just the liberals and the reformists who were shocked. Lenin immediately plunged into a battle to convince his own party to campaign to win a Bolshevik majority in the Soviets and for all power then to be passed into the hands of the Soviets. Lenin found the Bolshevik party thrown into confusion by the unexpected fall of Tsarism and the assumption of power by these liberal politicians. In his celebrated April theses, Lenin announced that Russia was now passing to the revolution's second stage, which he said must place power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorest sections of the peasants. There was an immediate political convulsion. Had Lenin adopted Trotsky's long-derided theory of permanent revolution? Lenin threatened to split from the Bolshevik party and to campaign as one man rather than retreat from this stance. His will prevailed, and on this basis, Trotsky's group promptly joined together with the Bolsheviks. 5 times in the course of the next 9 months, the people poured onto the streets in defense of their gains. In April, demonstrations led by the Bolsheviks forced the direct agents of capitalism out of the provisional government, and by their simple slogans and skillful propaganda, the Bolsheviks exposed the impotence of the hand-wringing bringing apologists for compromise with the liberals. Far from the stock caricature of the Bolsheviks as irresponsible rabble-rousers, when later in July the workers of Petrograd and the soldiers of the local garrison took to the streets again, impatient for a quick resolution of the impasse, it was the Bolsheviks who had to urge restraint until the provinces had caught up with them, because this was a spontaneous eruption of rage on the streets of Petrograd, and far from the crazed hotheads to their enemies' caricatures, the Bolsheviks had to exhaust all their reserves of patience and advocacy to hold them back from a premature seizure of power before the population in Russia's vast hinterland had been won to their cause. And in the ensuing crackdown, the leading Bolsheviks were jailed and Lenin was forced to flee to Finland and to go into hiding. Then in August, Petrograd was threatened with a bloody defeat at the hands of the advancing troops of the fascist general Kornilov. Kerensky proposed three options to Kornilov. He said, Kerensky, I'll take power as dictator, or we can have a joint twin dictatorship of Kerensky and Kornilov, or Kornilov could take power as the dictator. And on consideration, Kornilov opted for the latter. The Kerensky government found itself therefore helpless, paralyzed. It was the Bolsheviks who organized the workers and soldiers of Petrograd in a united front with Kerensky to repel Kornilov. Thousands of workers and soldiers fanned out from Petrograd to meet Kornilov's troops at the railway stations and the approaches to the capital, and by sheer passion, oratory, and force of numbers, they succeeded in repulsing the threat. Kornilov's troops melted away. And by September, the crucial moment had arrived. Months of patient explanation against a dramatic background of events had won an overwhelming majority to the side of the Bolsheviks. Still, even the Central Committee hesitated and prevaricated. Not for the first time, Lenin threatened to resign and campaign among the ranks of the party rather than countenance any further delay. By sheer force of will and personality, he prevailed, though Kamenev and Zinoviev in a panic publicly protested, provoking Lenin's denunciation of them at the time as strikebreakers. Although once the insurrection had triumphed, his rage subsided. Resuming his post after 12 years as chair of the Petrograd Soviet, Trotsky established a military revolutionary committee to organize the seizure of power. The insurrection of 25th of October, which was 7th of November in the new calendar, in the name of the assembling Congress of Soviets, met with pitiful, negligible resistance. A small delegation led by the sailor Antonov entered the cabinet room at the Winter Palace. A minister opened the door to him, nervously asked him, "What do you want?" And Antonov replied, "I inform you, all of you, members of the provisional government, that you are under arrest." And that was it. The lazy, hackneyed argument of most pro-capitalist historians is that the October Revolution was a conspiracy organized behind the scenes by a secretive Bolshevik cabal, a coup. The truth is that at the time of the collapse of the Tsarist regime, the Bolsheviks had numbered no more than 8,000 throughout the length and breadth of Russia, with its population of more than 150 million. But within 5 months, their membership had grown more than 20-fold to 177,000. And by September, on the eve of the revolution, in the words of Sukhanov, and Sukhanov was a Menshevik and a bitter enemy of Bolshevism, but these were Sukhanov's words describing the role of the Bolsheviks. For the masses, the Bolsheviks have become their own people. They have become the sole hope. The mass lived and breathed together with the Bolsheviks. So the overthrow of the capitalist government had been a simple matter of hours, with practically no fighting in the capital and only a short burst of gunfire in Moscow. The Russian ruling class had forfeited all authority, and the so-called socialist stooges in the provisional government, behind whom they had been forced to shelter after April, had lost all trace of credibility. The people were clamoring for peace, bread, and land. Kerensky had led 1 million more to slaughter on the front, halved the red bread ration, and turned his guns onto peasants, spontaneously taking over the great landed estates. No one respected theory more than Lenin, but he summed up very simply what had happened. The masses, he said, learn more in a day of social revolution than in decades of socialist theory. An ounce of experience is worth a ton of theory. And far from establishing a one-party state, as was alleged, the first revolutionary government was not even a one-party government. It was a coalition with the left social revolutionaries, the more radical wing of the Peasant Party. Even the left Menshevik internationalist Martov was invited to join the provisional government, the revolutionary government, but in fact he stormed out in a futile fit of temper. So the October Revolution was far from a coup. But there's another variant of the same argument. Was the October Revolution then perhaps a mistake? As if we could construct our own historical context. The insurrection was conceived by an entire generation of militant Russian workers as merely a preliminary step towards a European-wide socialist revolution. If they had let slip the opportunity, the alternative could only have been a bloody defeat at the hands of General Kornilov, the contemporary Franco or Pinochet, from which it would have taken 1 or 2 generations at least to recover. It was taken for granted that unless it were to spread westwards, the Russian Revolution would inevitably be crushed. No one at the time could have conceived of the possibility that the Soviet state could survive in isolation for decades, even as a grotesquely mangled, bureaucratically deformed monstrosity. Driven beyond breaking point by slaughter at the front and hunger at home, the Russian workers, soldiers, and peasants had overthrown their oppressors. If they had foreseen the tribulations ahead of them in 1917, would they have launched their revolution? Who can say? History hasn't granted them the luxury of contemplation. They were impelled by the immediate duress of slaughter at the front and hunger at home. It was not their revolution, but its isolation in conditions of virtual barbarism, the failure of the revolution elsewhere, not their victory at home, that doomed them to the privations ahead, as we'll hear in the second part of this series. If the Russian workers and peasants had foreseen the tribulations ahead of them, would they have launched their revolution? Driven beyond breaking point, as I say, from the slaughter and the hunger, they overthrew their oppressors. Their country was already steeped in age-old backwardness, with only pockets of industry, low productivity, long hours, mass illiteracy, and a per capita income about 1/10 of that of the USA. But by the time they emerged from 3 years of civil war and foreign armed intervention, Russia was plagued with mass starvation, deadly epidemics, a desperate scarcity of finance, technical expertise, and spare parts. 7 million homeless orphans roamed the country. Cannibalism was rife. Industrial production was down to 1/9 of the 1913 figure, and agricultural produce had fallen well below the pre-1900 level. But the point is, history had not granted them the luxury of contemplation. They were impelled by the relentless duress of the issues that faced them at the time. In the hour of danger that was approaching, with the brutal intervention of no less than 21 armies of foreign capitalism, it was the active support of working people throughout Europe that was the crucial factor in saving the revolution from defeat. Now, I'm going to pause there. That was we've come to the seizure of power in October. I would like to strongly recommend. Of course, there are countless books on the subject, but 3 books in particular I would like to recommend. First, for a most stirring eyewitness account of these events, of course, John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, as a journalist who was on the spot day by day, relating the events as they unfurled. Then there's a short summary of the events of that year by China Mieville called October. But above all, of course, I want to recommend the book that I think I would class it perhaps as the best book ever written, which is Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, which is of course a unique eyewitness vantage point account of the events as they unfurled. But more than that, it's a penetrating, sparkling analysis of a society in decay and a society on the cusp of renewal. And I'll leave it at that for now. If there's any questions, you're welcome.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Roger. Well done. Thank you. Lots to discuss, lots to disagree, agree. Please click raise hand if you want to speak. I do in particular like that quote by Lenin when he said a few months before the revolution, you know, not in my lifetime, probably not in my lifetime. That's quite inspiring to show how things can sometimes change rather quickly. Not that we're anywhere near that at the moment, but things do change quickly in particular times. Okay, comrades, I've got Matthew Jones first to speak. Please, anybody who wants to make a contribution or has a question, please click raise hand and I'll bring you in. Where are you? Okay. Can you start your camera, please, Matthew? There you are. There you go.
This thing is not.
Yep, there you are. You can start.
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out if I can get this picture to come up on my screen. Not sure why that's happening. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, comrades, thanks to Roger for that introduction. It's really, really good. I think that, I mean, really for me, it's to try to draw out some of the theoretical stuff. I think that the real theoretical spade work for the Russian Revolution is, of course, done by Trotsky. I mean, you know, as a brilliant theorist. I mean, obviously, an enormous amount of work by Lenin as well. Although he tended to write in terms of notes, and you know, rather than actually producing a great deal of theoretical pieces. I mean, I think the important thing really is to look at the impact of 1905 as a start, because I mean, everybody, if you know, read Trotsky, I mean, he and others also as an understanding of as the precursor, the scene set for 1917. Which I think the important thing is that really, what is the nature of the, first of all, what is the nature of the party? In that, what you get from, particularly from 1905, is the production of a party, particularly Bolshevik party, which is an alliance between the rebellious intelligentsia, you know, and the working class, particularly the skilled workers, you know, and it's those two elements together. And at the same time, it's also the party itself managed to draw into itself a whole series of people at a very young age. I mean, you look at, you know, there's a whole series of teenagers who joined the Bolsheviks in 1905 and had leading roles in the party throughout its existence. And that, you know, it's that sort of generation of people. At the same time, as you say, you know, I agree, you know, it is particularly Trotsky, who sees the Soviet in contrast to Lenin's what is to be done. That the Soviet is obviously the implement of power of the working class, and then puts himself at the head of it and becomes the vice president of the Soviet in St. Petersburg, which is is a key role. And then of course it's then his theory of permanent revolution. Results and Prospects, a book which he writes in prison along with Parvus, as a result of that revolution, drawing out of that the lessons of that revolution, which is precisely that that it shows that the capitalist class has surrendered any progressive role in history. It has gone over to the forces of reaction. It has no more to offer. Everything has to be done in terms of moving the whole of society forwards, has to be done by the working class. And it is only at the point, really, when you get to 1917, that Lenin and the Bolsheviks come over to that position. And actually, Lenin's April thesis. Actually, is Lenin going over to Trotsky's position? No, Lenin then says he hasn't actually read Results and Prospects of Permanent Revolution until after the thing happened. But the point is that clearly is Trotsky's position and Trotsky's innovation in those terms, and it remains incredibly important today. That precisely that the capitalist class has no progressive role in history at all to play anywhere. It is only the working class that will drive the whole thing. The other thing, of course, the other piece of Trotsky, another piece of his great insight, of course, is combined and uneven development, in which he looks at, he clearly sees Russia as being this thing where, you're right, you have a backward society and so on, a peasant society which has only just been released from serfdom in many cases, and the abolition of serfdom was only in the 1860s. And in fact, I mean, by custom and practice, a lot of the sort of social methodology was still there, but at the same time, you have these enormous factories planted in the middle of all that, which become key in terms of the development of this Russian working class and its combativity. That you have factories with tens of thousands of people, which are critical in development of that. And so these things are deeply contradictory. And I think the other thing that we have to bear in mind always with the Russian Revolution is to say, okay, well, it's probably the most discussed event in history. Certainly in recent history. I mean, I've got several meters of shelving just of books by participants or about the Russian Revolution. Now there are many other people who've got much more than me. The reason for that is because precisely that it does point the way to the future, as Serge said, making the point from his jail cell in one of the most vile prisons in France, that this is it, this solves everything. The Russian Revolution points the way to the future, which it does. And the point being really is what it does is it says to everybody, particularly the ruling class, look, we can be rid of you. We can dispose of you. And not only that, you're on notice, you will be disposed of. And that fundamentally damages the entire foundations of capitalism itself and changes it beyond recognition. And that persists. I mean, despite whatever ruins there are in Russia now, the fact that the working class has seized power and has clearly put the ruling class on notice fundamentally changes the nature of relations ever since. And also, of course, brings that lesson to the left and to the working class. Look, this can be done. It has to be done. It needs to be done. And it is your job to do it. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Roger, I suggest I bring another one or two speakers in before I bring you back.
Yeah, that's fine. Yes, sure.
Okay. Victor, please. Victor?
Asleep.
Sorry?
I think he's asleep, isn't he?
Is he?
Looks
Just
it.
camera off.
No, I can see a camera. There's two Victor Vogans there.
Okay. Oh, well, if he's sleeping, we shan't wake him. Tony, do you want to go next?
Yes, okay. I mean, following on really from Matthew, the first and only workers' revolution in Europe took place in the most backward country in Europe, where the working class was a tiny minority. And the failure of that revolution, Roger, was because it failed revolution failed to spread to other countries, in particular the German Revolution, and there was the aborted Hungarian Revolution, which was drowned in blood, etc. Does this suggest that in advanced capitalist countries, the working class simply is not strong enough or conscious enough of its own strength to be able to overthrow capitalism, bearing in mind it's now over a century since the first and only workers' revolution? Insofar as capitalism has been superseded or was superseded in different parts of the world, for example, China, it wasn't through a socialist revolution. It was as much through a national liberation struggle, which in the end went backwards. I mean, I think most people would accept that China today is a capitalist state. So I'd be interested in your comments about that. Why, in essence, has the Bolshevik Revolution been the only example to date where the rule of the capitalist class has been overthrown, or the existing orders? Because in Russia, of course, the capitalists weren't in power. And really subsidiary to that was that because the Russian state was in essence a medieval construction held together by a Tsarist order, which had long been past its due date. So I just throw that out.
In a way, it's difficult because, there are so many questions which wouldn't, but some of which, of course, will be dealt with in a lot of detail in your subsequent, episodes of the series, if you like. But really, Tony has raised the crucial question for all of us. Why is it that it's over a century since the only time when you can say that workers' organizations took power? I would not say that there's been no revolution or no socialist revolution in a distorted way. We've seen them in many, many, many countries. But the classic form of the working class seizing the power into their hands and creating their own state, and holding on to that, of course, that's the crucial thing. The only example is Russia. Now, the question is, the answer to it is we need to look at every episode in the subsequent drama of history. And we're doing that. That's precisely why we have a series, Revolution and Counter-Revolution, in the 20th century. And you'd have to examine each one and explain what the factors were. It's not easy to carry through a socialist revolution. There are, every possible obstacles in the path. But the fact that we're here, the fact that we're members of Labour Left Alliance, the fact that we're attending discussions like this in order to examine the history of the working class is the proof that we all know, or we all feel the confidence that the revolution is possible, and that what the Russian workers achieved briefly for the moment they held the power in their hands, that can be achieved on a completely secure and stable basis in all the countries of the world, and particularly in the advanced capitalist countries and the metropolitan countries. One of the points, so in Matthew, I completely agree with everything that Matthew said. I do think that, one of the lessons of the Russian Revolution that we have to take and, really always keep in mind is that the great revolutionaries never thought that they had the answers and that all they needed to do was to bestow their wisdom on the working class, and that would be it. They learned from the process of the struggle themselves. Now, Lenin's formula was, it proved to be inadequate, should we put it that way? His formula of the democratic dictatorship of the workers and the poor peasants. But I think the way that Trotsky put it was right, that it was not so much a false or incorrect slogan, but that it was an algebraic formula which was open, if you like, to development and evolution in the course of events as they took place. Lenin did learn, and Lenin and Trotsky's program for the revolution was that of the permanent revolution, and in that sense, you could say that Lenin adopted the theory of Trotsky. But at the same time, Trotsky was absolutely clear. I was thinking of saying he never forgave himself. Perhaps that would put it too strongly. But he said that he was mistaken in not recognizing the absolute necessity of joining with the Bolsheviks, even when they had this incomplete and algebraic slogan of joining with the Bolsheviks, because of the harsh imperative necessity of the struggle that they were going through. Trotsky in those early days was not sufficiently cognizant of the huge pressures that were coming. You could say the same of Rosa Luxemburg, that theoretically their ideas were absolutely brilliant and completely perceptive, showed a real, a remarkable, unique insight. But maybe that the fault was, and that Trotsky corrected it, and Rosa Luxemburg was on the way to doing it, but was cut short before she could, achieve that goal of to organize, to mobilize, to create the disciplined forces that were able to put those ideas, those theoretical ideas, into operation. I see, comments have come up about many other examples where there have been blows struck against capitalism. Yes, China. Yes, Cuba. Venezuela, I think, is the jury is out on where that's going to end up. But the question is that no doubt we'll be discussing this separately, but the Chinese Revolution, for instance, was brought by a peasant guerrilla army. The working class played no role whatsoever in the seizure of power by the Chinese Red Army. In fact, when they greeted the entry of the guerrilla soldiers of Mao's army in the cities, they were actually, they were ruthlessly put down by the Red Army. There was it was a classic example of Bonapartism, where the leaders of a independent force wobbled and vacillated and leaned now on one side and then on another. And it was only after a sort of complicated series of maneuvers that in the end the economy was nationalized, and in a very distorted, grotesquely deformed way, nevertheless, a non-capitalist society was created, a society which was, you could say, had a socialist economic basis, but never had the political democratic superstructure that existed for a period in Russia in 1917. In Cuba also, I mean, initially the Cuba guerrilla army came to the cities, came to Havana. It was not the program initially of Castro to act against capitalism. Of course, to act against individual capitalists and to act against the corruption and so on. But it was only after the intervention of U.S. imperialism that eventually that they nationalized the economy. But again, in Cuba too, despite the stupendous achievements and victories of the Cuban regime, which I have no hesitation in applauding, but it was never a workers' revolution. It was never a workers' socialist revolution. It was a bureaucracy that imposed by a guerrilla army that fitfully, by fits and starts, carried through a process which ended up with a nationalized economy. There are many other points, but I won't go on anymore. By the way, some of the questions that were raised are precisely what I'm intending to cover in part 2 of this series.
Thanks, Roger. Looking forward to it. Okay, Victor, and then Steve Freeman. Victor, are you there? Victor, we can't, for some reason, see you when I'm trying to bring you in. Are you there? No, okay. Steve Freeman then.
I think Victor's turning up occasionally, but I can't see.
No,
his
You
face.
can't see or
No,
hear me. Hello?
I can hear you.
Oh dear.
If that's you,
You can hear me.
let him go
Good.
first if we can hear him, Tina, shall we?
okay, go
Thank
on.
you very much.
Fine.
Yes, I've been thinking about the situation in Russia in 1917. It seems to me, and I wonder if you all agree with this, that there was 2 revolutions. The first one was a coalition of groups who had very little in common. It ranged from fascists, all sorts of capitalists, liberals, to communists and Marxists. And the only thing they had in common was a common desire to get rid of the Tsar. And it was probably necessary that they did the first February Revolution as a coalition, because none of the groups might have been strong enough to remove the Tsar on their own. And then it was the second revolution that decided which of the successful parties in the first revolution ended up ruling Russia. Would you agree that that's a fair analysis of what happened? Thank you.
Okay, Steve next.
I'm slightly more sympathetic to what Victor's just said, but I don't quite agree with it. But it does highlight something. I think we have to ask some fundamental questions about what is a socialist revolution, because I agree that in Russia they did fly the red flag, they did sing the Internationale, they did nationalize whole swathes of the economy as they did in China. But in my book, that doesn't make a socialist revolution. And in fact, even the concept of a national socialist revolution should be questioned. Because I think a socialist revolution, that was Trotsky's view, was international. I'll come back to that. It's in essence international. And I think that's where we have to come back to it. If we're not going to understand it in that way, then we have to understand it in a different way. I think it's probably understood as a democratic revolution, whose reference point was probably France in 1792 or 3 or something, but more importantly, the Paris Commune of 1871. I think that's the reference point that Lenin gives it later. And what's peculiar about Russia is it's quite clear there's only one class in Russia that could establish democracy in Russia. The only class that could do that, the only class that had an interest in creating a democratic, properly democratic republic in Russia was the working class, not the bourgeoisie. So if it was a democratic revolution, its peculiarity was that it required the leadership of the working class. That was the only way that that could be done. With the peasantry, of course, because most people were peasants anyway. You know, most people weren't, as you pointed out, Roger. I don't know if I said it at the beginning, but I meant to say I really enjoyed your talk. So if I forgot to say that at the beginning, let me just throw that in right now. I enjoyed listening to what you had to say. But Trotsky and Lenin always understood that the Russian Revolution could never be a socialist revolution. It could never actually abolish capitalism. And in fact, capitalism was never abolished, I would say. You know, they were right on that. Capitalism was never abolished, because to have done that would have required Petrograd to have linked up with Berlin, Berlin to have linked up with Vienna, Paris, and London. So if we had a revolution that went from Petrograd, Berlin, Paris, London, Vienna, etc., then we could start talking a socialist revolution. But of course, we know Berlin got in on the act a little bit, and maybe Vienna or whatever, but it never really it never really got going. It was defeated, and Russia went back on itself. So what do we have? We have this republic that Victor just described with this peculiar alliance, this republic that people were really enthusiastic about, but it was deeply flawed. I mean, they were soon disillusioned in it. The working class created that republic, the first one. Lenin turned up and said, this is never going to work. And he was obviously quite right with that. He said, we've got to go further. We've got to create a second republic. We need another one. And therefore, we must base it on the organs of working class democracy, more like the Paris Commune. And that was essentially what he's saying in State and Revolution. And so we had the second republic, if you like. The first one, the second one, as you described, Roger. And then if you look what happened to that, I think we just go a little bit beyond that. Maybe that's going, I think we've got to include in this story the counter-revolution that came against them, the civil war that destroyed just about everything, which they managed to survive from, but they lost their democracy. That's what happened during the course of the Civil War. They were destroyed, and much of the working class was destroyed. And so you come to this point of Petrograd in 1921, where there's an attempt, an uprising in Petrograd to recreate the democracy that people wanted back from October. So I think that the end of the democratic revolution was 1921 with Kronstadt. Did I say Petrograd? I meant to say Kronstadt, the Kronstadt uprising, the failure of the Kronstadt uprising to spread beyond there. So I think that's a tragic story, but we have a lot to learn from it because it shows how far the working class can take our democracy. And only by doing that can we possibly get to socialism. So I think with that in mind, I think you can explain China in the way you did, Roger, and Cuba in the way they're kinds of democratic revolutions. The working class never came to power in either of those cases, but they did nationalize, they did take over their economies, the new bourgeoisie in those countries. So I think your story, what happens there, works with this story, which is to see it through the lens of democracy and not really through the lens of socialism, but only the potential for socialism. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, comrade. Roger, oh no, there's Ed Boba wants to speak. There's somebody asked, Mike asked in the question in the chat here, is there any recommended books you could recommend on the Civil War before next week's session? Perhaps when I bring you back to sum up, you could mention something. Okay, Ed, if you could start your video and your microphone, I can bring you in to ask a question.
Right, okay. Comrades, if I fail during the course of this talk, it's because I've got a very bad cold, and but I found I wasn't intending to say anything, but I found Roger's introduction and several of the questions so interesting that I couldn't resist putting up my hand. If I have to stop talking, I just will. One of the comrades said, does a revolution have to be brought about by military activity? And I'd like to say that I don't think that's the case at all. The fundamental driving force for a socialist revolution is a mass movement of the working class. And of course, at some points in taking on our enemies, as was the case in the Russian Revolution, sections of the working class may have to arm and be organized to deal with the threat of counter-revolution. But the main feature of socialist revolution is democracy and full participation of the mass of the people in the events that are taking place. And it's almost the antithesis of military action. Military action is far more a hallmark of counter-revolution than revolution. Was it the case that none of the groups on their own in February 1917 was strong enough to overthrow the Tsarist regime? I don't think that was the case. I think the Tsarist regime was very weak, in fact, far weaker. This is part of the answer to the point that Tony raised of, what happened to the other possibilities for revolution. I mean, in the advanced capitalist countries, like Germany, Britain, and France, the state apparatus and the sophistication of the ruling class was far more of a strong adversary than in February 1917. I think the reason why there was a delay between the initial overthrow of the Tsarist regime in February and the conquest of power by the working class in October is because it took time for the political consciousness of the mass of the working class and the population to mature enough to understand that this wasn't simply a question of replacing the Tsar with another bourgeois democratic regime, that there was no scope for any stable bourgeois democracy, and something far more fundamental and revolutionary and potentially socialist had to be built. And of course, that was entirely linked up with the internationalism of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, because they knew that Russia was too backward a country in which socialism could be built on its own. And just in the final point, in commenting on what Tony Green said, does it suggest that in advanced capitalist countries, the working class is not conscious enough to make a socialist revolution? Well, in the immediate years after the Russian Revolution, there were numerous examples of workers in practically every country in Europe rising up and attempting to make revolutions. I mean, perhaps the clearest example of that was in 1923 in Germany, where after hyperinflation, workers just, on their own initiative, without really even any leadership on the part of the Communist Party, workers just came onto the streets, set up their own Soviets, began improvising new forms of government locally, and so on. And we have even there, we have the beginning of the answer to Tony's question. There was a lot of hesitation on the part of the regime in Moscow as to whether to encourage the German workers to take power. And as these revolutionary opportunities developed in other parts of Europe, I mean, in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s as well, and the British general strike, I mean, more and more as Stalinism began to consolidate its grip on the Russian Revolution, then the advice of the Stalinist regime in Moscow towards these other revolutions was to develop a popular front with the bourgeois capitalist parties, to tone down the revolution, to compromise, not to go for a full overthrow of the capitalist regime. It's a kind of two-stage theory of the revolution. And I mean, what I'm saying is, despite the enthusiasm and the energy of millions of workers in dozens of countries in the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution to follow on and do the same, the complication of leadership in the working class movement meant that those revolutions weren't as clear in their strategy and tactics as Lenin and the Bolsheviks had enabled the Russian Revolution to be. It wasn't out of any lack of consciousness that those revolutions weren't successful. It was more to do with factors that are not so big anymore in the current situation. I mean, we don't have the weight of Stalinism crushing down on the revolutionary initiatives of workers anymore. In this generation, there is different scope for picking up where some of those who tried to emulate the Russian Revolution left off. Thank you, that's it. I did manage to get through without flaking.
Thanks, comrade. Get well, and you spoke very well, I thought.
Thank you.
Okay, Roger.
Right, so I think it's been a really lively and interesting discussion. First, just that question about books on the Civil War. I'm sure there are, I don't know any specific books on the Civil War, but there's ample material in Trotsky's writings, in his memoirs, his terrorism and communism, scattered through articles and all the rest of it. So I think it was Mike who asked that question. I think there's a gold mine of material there. Well, Victor raised the question about he said there were two revolutions in Russia. I don't think it's quite right to say that first, first it was a coalition of the bourgeois and the working class, and because neither was strong enough. That I do think that's a misconception. The point is that the capitalists had absolutely no wish whatsoever to overthrow the Tsarist regime. They wanted to nudge to get some, some concessions and so on from Tsarism, but they were terrified of the movement of the working class, and it was the working class which overthrew the Tsarist regime. It was, well, if you want to pinpoint it, it was the women workers of Petrograd who defeated, by standing up to them, who defeated the, well, won over the troops, won over even sections of the Cossacks, and just stood firm. And the state machine simply crumbled. It was rotten to its foundations, and it crumbled, if you like, at that puff of wind that came from that point, because life was so absolutely intolerable for the reasons that I outlined before. So the reason why, never mind the capitalists, even some princes and so on, hastily scrambled together a coalition government, is because they were desperate somehow to cling on to their power and property and privileges. And that's why when Lenin came back and demanded that the program of the working class, the program of the Bolsheviks, had to be to overthrow that coalition government and to seize the power and to take power, not just in the name of the party, but in the name of the Soviets, the organic democracy of the workers and together with their allies, the soldiers and peasants. That was why Lenin not only raised that slogan, but was proved to be correct by the unfolding of the revolution itself. So Steve raised some very interesting questions, which again, will take a long time to answer. But I do think that what's behind what the questions that he raised, and a number of other comrades, is this question of the international dimension. Now, I had saved up, I've got pages of notes to answer that question, if you like, to emphasize the incredible degree of internationalism of not just of the Bolsheviks, not just of the most conscious elements, but of workers, soldiers on the streets, even peasant leaders like Spiridonova. It's all quoted in John Reed and in the other books that I mentioned, but particularly in John Reed's thing. And he was not a he didn't go there as an ally of the Bolsheviks or as a revolutionary. He went there simply as a journalist and to monitor what was happening. But he was so caught up in it, and he was so absolutely engrossed and swept up by the enthusiasm of the masses. And he shows from page 1 to the last page of his book the internationalism of everybody who was involved. It was inconceivable. Nobody could, it didn't even enter anybody's mind, from Lenin down to the simplest soldier, the idea that Russia could carry through a socialist revolution. The slogans they were chanting and the speeches they were making were not about how now Russia is going to go towards socialism. I mean, that was just I mean, it was a completely bizarre, nonsensical delusion, that idea. Their idea was, we have broken through to the world revolution. We've broken the chain of capitalism and led the way to the working class of Europe and the world. I'd like to I'll give one quote, if you like, a preview. When Lenin said, without aid from the international world revolution, the victory of the proletarian revolution is impossible. And he said, this is towards the end, of course, of his life, we did our utmost to preserve the Soviet system under any circumstances and at all costs, because we knew that we were working not only for ourselves, but also for the international revolution. And in fact, in March 1918, he wrote that there could be no hope of the ultimate victory of our revolution if it was to remain alone. If the German Revolution does not come, we are doomed. And there's many more examples that I could give. Just one more. A soldier on the street who ran into John Reed and asked him who he was, and John Reed say, I'm an American. I'm here to see to give my greetings. And the soldier said, what are the American workers doing? Are they going to take power too? Are they going to join us? I mean, the International was kind of, it was at the roots and suffused the whole of the revolution, and therefore, the idea that that anything could be achieved simply within the confines of Tsarist feudal Russia was, was absolutely inconceivable. Really, I think I'll leave it at that. I hope to see you all next week, and I hope to be able to give substance to those few points I made just now.
I'm sure you will. Thank you very much, comrade.